then there was a question in Russian, and it came from Natasha Dabija, who is a wonderful animator and had won Oscars for her work. So I was very interested in what question was coming from her. And then Olga, the interpreter, turned to me after hearing the question in Russian and said, "I'm not going to translate this." And I said, "Oh dear, why not?" She said, no one should ask this question. I think it's one of the paradoxes of The Miracle Maker, which is, of course, a film dramatizing the very heart of the Christian faith, the whole story of Jesus, the passion, the resurrection, that the film was made by a wide variety of people from many different perspectives. And I would say there were only a very small number of Christians involved. It was not a Christian film. I'm very hesitant anyway using the word Christian as an adjective. That never appears in the Bible. It's a Christian is a noun, and it's only used even as a noun 3 times in the New Testament. Once you say something's a Christian painting or a Christian screenwriter, for example, you get labeled and all sorts of issues arise. So I'm a screenwriter, I'm a playwright. I'm not a Christian playwright. I'm a playwright who happens to be a Christian, and that does inform my life and my work. But I'm very positive about the fact that The Miracle Maker was made by people who were completely committed to great storytelling, to the highest production values. And it was an incredibly beautiful collaboration. And there were atheists I was working very closely with, and certainly many agnostics. The Russians largely were not Christians. And there was a fascinating moment, actually, in the whole process of making The Miracle Maker. By this time, I'd written the screenplay, and I was asked to give a talk or be interviewed to about 100 animators, people working on the movie who were gathered in a hall in Moscow at Christmas Film Studios, if I remember. And there was an interpreter working with me who was actually an extremely intelligent woman. She was a fellow of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and she was therefore translating questions coming to me. Anyway, lots of interesting questions about the film, how it came about, my attitude to the screenplay, what I thought it was, what I thought it was about, and why I'd done it the way I had. But then there was a question in Russian, and it came from Natasha Dabija, who is a wonderful animator and had won Oscars for her work. And she was the one responsible for Tamar, the little girl at the center of The Miracle Maker. And I always marveled at Natasha's work. I thought, how can anyone make a 12-year-old girl move so beautifully and so authentically? And Natasha just had this exceptional ability. So I was very interested in what question was coming from her. And then Olga, the interpreter, turned to me after hearing the question in Russian and said, "I'm not going to translate this." And I said, "Oh dear, why not?" She said, no one should ask this question. And I thought, my goodness me, and being very British, I thought, what is this? Is this so private? Is it about my sex life? What is this? What is this question? You cannot translate. And I said to Olga, no, please translate the question. I'll do my best to answer it. And Olga very reluctantly said, the question is, are you a believer? There was silence in this huge hall. And I said, yes, I am. And I said, that's at the heart of my whole life. And that informs the whole screenplay, because I'm writing something that I believe really happened and has enormous importance today. I believe that Jesus Christ is alive, this is the most important story of all to me. But, I said, and it's a big but, I think this film is so much better because there are a huge variety of perspectives. I don't think it would be a very good production if we were all Christians. I said the trouble with an all-Christian production is there are too many agendas, too many theological perspectives, too much protection, if you like, and overprotectiveness of the story. And I have experienced such situations where really the outcome has not been that good. And it often isn't a so-called Christian film or Christian production. But I said, here we have many of you here who don't share my faith, and some of you may believe, the opposite, or that there is no God, or all this is a made-up myth. But I know you respect the story, and I know you care hugely about your art, and I know that there's great integrity throughout this production. And I was aware as I was talking that I had never really discussed my faith with my British counterparts. So I was there with about half a dozen or so people from Britain, producers and others. And I hadn't really talked much. I mean, people knew that I was a Christian, but that was about it. And suddenly I'm discussing this. And I knew that my British counterparts, save one, were not really, or maybe two, as I think about it, although there's such a thing as a lapsed Christian or somebody trying to find their way back to faith. But on the whole, there was a tiny, tiny proportion of believers, to use Olga's phrase, involved. But it was good because in a way, the British team then heard my perspective that I thought it was actually a very, very good thing. I mean, I can remember, for example, one of the series editors who was very much a staunch atheist, and I'd had many discussions, some of them quite heated in previous years because he was a friend, about issues of faith. And anyway, in working on The Miracle Maker, I said to him, Martin, I would love there to be more resurrection scenes in this film than there's ever been in any film about Jesus. And he said, well, that's fine as far as I'm concerned. I don't believe any of this stuff at all. He said, but if it's a good story and you can convince me that it's going to work dramatically, then go ahead. And what was interesting was the freedom that I had. There was this huge respect for me as a believer, but above all as a writer, and convinced me, and that was a great quality, I think, in this film, that it's like a glorious collaboration of a kind of multifaceted example of humanity, different cultures, English, Russian, Welsh, American, all sorts of different perspectives nationally, but a sort of coming together. It was a spiritual coming together, even though, as I say, many, many people didn't believe or had lost contact with whatever belief there might have been in previous generations and were maybe reaching out for it a little in the case of some Russians. But there was a kind of spiritual power nonetheless. And I remember sitting at the first screening of the film, private screening, with the director, Derek Hayes, was somebody who was in many ways, did share my faith. But we sat there and he watched the film with me, and then he turned to me and said, there's something in this film that we didn't put there. And I said, yes, Derek, absolutely. I said, this is much more than the sum total of all the parts, the directing, the screenwriting, even the brilliant acting. There's something here, something beyond. And we both felt a presence, an extraordinary light, a power, something that was really way beyond, transcendent, beyond what we could have achieved. And it was a very moving and humbling moment. I haven't had many of those in my life, but it was one of those moments where I just thought, well, I'm speaking here as a believer, I just thought God is in this. And I know the opposite can happen. For example, I believe that when Pasolini made what was his final film, Salo, The Last 100 Days of Sodom, he watched the film in a private screening and then said, there's something in this film I didn't put there. And he wasn't referring to something good. He was talking about evil. And that's very interesting. He wasn't a believer, although he had made an amazing film about Christ. But it can happen. And I think here's a mystery, really, isn't it, in the world of the arts. And it's nothing to do with whether people believe or don't believe, or whether they're good or evil or indifferent. Sometimes in an artwork, in a great work of music, great paintings, great plays, films, there's something there which is very remarkable, which exists in its own right. And I can confidently say that was true of the Miracle Maker.